Winston Churchill was once asked, "Doesn't it thrill you to know that every time you make a speech, the hall is packed to overflowing?" "It's quite flattering," replied Sir Winston. "But whenever I feel that way, I always remember that if instead of making a political speech, I was being hanged, the crowd would be twice as big." Churchill must have been familiar with the book of Sirach, which tells us to conduct our affairs with humility, or the gospel where Jesus says, "Humble ourselves, the greater we are. He who exalts himself shall be humbled." In an article for the Wall Street Journal, researcher Jonah Lehrer writes about the power trap. He writes that it's an incredibly consistent effect. When you give people power, they basically start acting like fools. They flirt inappropriately, they tease in hostile fashion, they become totally impulsive. And he concludes by saying that even the most virtuous people can be undone by that corner office. Now, this was a constant theme in Shakespeare's plays. One critic of Shakespeare, John Whitney, tells us that if we look into Shakespeare's mirror, we will see ourselves, because his plays show the seduction of power and how easily it slips away. Macbeth was an immensely ambitious man who is compelled to do things that he knows are morally and politically wrong. Julius Caesar is rigid and dogmatic. He wants to live forever in the minds of the people. He believes he is eternal. Iago invents elaborate lies in order to exploit and manipulate others. He treats others as fools. King Lear cares for no one. His whole life is revenge. He loves absolute power, and he's not comfortable with anyone contradicting or challenging him. Hamlet's an enigma. Each time we look at him, he's different, and he lived a life of tortuous dilemmas. Richard III is the embodiment of evil. He's a villain who stops at nothing, and people are seduced by his brilliant wordplay. It took him 23 years to get the crown and 2 years to lose it. Over and over again, Shakespeare reminds us that the best leaders seek power for the common good and not for their own self-aggrandizement. Long before Shakespeare, of course, in that first reading, Sirach challenged us to be humble. And then Jesus took the challenge up 2,000 years ago. But the human race really hasn't listened to those messages very well. Hitler died in his bunker. Mussolini was hanged by his heels. Baby Doc Duvalier was banished. Mao and Stalin and Lenin are now seen for who they were. They were ruthless murderers, not compassionate servants of the people. Compassionate servants of the people. I think that's what Sirach and Jesus in the gospel were challenging all of us to as far as leadership today. That's the kind of leadership we need in our world, our country, our community, our church, our corporations. Not a King Lear who was unable to listen to his most trusted lieutenants when they confronted him with the evil that he was doing. What was his response? He fired them. Or not an Iago who turned against Othello because he didn't get the promotion he thought that he deserved. Author David Bobb tells us that no one is naturally humble, that becoming humble is an arduous process. And he uses the examples of Ben Franklin and George Washington, who had to struggle their entire lives to work out their ego and to become humble. because their egos were enormous when they were young. Benjamin Franklin became aware of his enormous ego, and he himself set out on a project that he called moral perfection. He made a list of 12 areas of his life that needed improvement, and then he asked a friend of his to give him some feedback. First mistake. And in his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin said, "This is what this man said. He kindly informed me that I was generally thought proud, that my pride showed itself frequently in conversation." So Franklin didn't just have 12 areas of his life that he had to improve, he had to add the 13th. In Washington's early haste to achieve greatness, he sometimes let his ambition outpace his virtue. He gradually realized this, and he calibrated his actions accordingly. He began to recognize that the more he served others and the cause of justice, the more his success would matter. That the less his ambition was about his own fame, the more he would deserve the honors that he received. He discovered that virtue in this sense can be its own reward. So, what is the challenge we hear from the Scriptures today? What is humility? Well, humility asks all of us to acknowledge our imperfections. It requires that we admit when we are wrong, and then we change course. It counsels us to put others first in thought, in word, and deed. And it avoids the narcissistic self-promotion that we see so rampant today. Now, leadership expert Jim Collins, in an article for the Harvard Business Review, tells us that the best leaders exhibit the following characteristics. The first one is compelling modesty, shunning public adulation, never boastful. Secondly, the best leaders act with quiet, calm determination. They rely principally on inspired standards, not inspiring charisma to motivate people. Thirdly, they challenge ambition into their agency, into their company, into the corporation, not their self. They set up successors for even more greatness in the next generation. Fourthly, they look in the mirror, not out the window, to apportion responsibility for poor results, never blaming other people, external factors, or bad luck. And fifth, then they look out the window, not in the mirror, to apportion credit for the success of the company, to other people, to external factors, to good luck. I think that's the challenge that Sirach and Jesus give us this weekend. And they tell us that our world, our country, our community, our church, our businesses are in tremendous need today of great leaders. But unfortunately, so few are willing to get over themselves, to be truly compassionate servants of the people. Remember, humility doesn't come natural to any of us. We have to work at it. Churchill had to work at it. Benjamin Franklin had to work at it. George Washington had to work at it. And Shakespeare always reminds us of the consequences when we get too full of ourselves. Sirach, I believe, had it right. And certainly Jesus had it right. Everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled.